Foreign Trade Council and ITI. The purpose of today's session is to discuss the case for an ambitious services market access commitments as part of the JSI on e-commerce. I'm Jake Colvin, President of the National Foreign Trade Council. We're excited to host this session today with ITI and to be joined by an excellent group of speakers. First of all, I wanted to recognize Ambassador Santiago Wills, who's the permanent representative of Colombia to the WTO. Ambassador Wills, I know you're very busy with fisheries, as well as with e-commerce and other items, and so really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Also want to recognize Sarah English, who's the Vice President of Global Public Policy with MasterCard, and Eunice Wang, who's Head of APAC Trade Policy for Google. Both Sarah and Eunice are extremely thoughtful on services and digital tools, both on the nuts and bolts of market access commitments, but also on exploring the role of these tools and enabling small business success and economic development. And also very glad to be joined by Sam Rizzo, who's the Senior Director of Policy for ITI. Sam, really appreciate the chance to collaborate with you on this event, as well as the paper that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So the idea for this session stems from a paper that NFTC and ITI wrote, which makes the case for ambitious services market access commitments as part of the e-commerce negotiations. And to paraphrase just a bit, I think what we try to emphasize is that digital trade provisions aren't enough to guarantee access to that entire e-commerce ecosystem that all of us use to engage in the global economy. You need robust market access commitments as well. And so as we continue to deal with the pandemic, I think this is an important moment for policymakers. Because, on the one hand, the past year and a half has hammered home the importance of digital tools. Small businesses who use digital tools intensively were more than 3 times as likely to engage in global markets, and their businesses were more resilient during the pandemic. There's also evidence in the United States that suggests that women and minority-owned businesses benefit disproportionately when they engage in the global marketplace. Yet, as we point out in the report, last year, twice as many restrictive policy changes were implemented on cross-border trade and services. And some countries are even talking about embracing a policy of import substitution that would purposely wall off access to foreign digital services. And so amid all of this, you have the e-commerce discussions. We're discussing digital trade rules and trade facilitation, and services market access is on the table. And so with that, I wanted to bring Sam first into the discussion and maybe step back with kind of a broad question for you. So Sam, could you sort of talk to us about the role of services market access in enabling digital trade, and what do you see as some of those key sectors that enable that entire e-commerce ecosystem?
Sure, and thanks so much, Jake, to you and to NFTC for co-hosting this session, and for all of your organizational work, as well as to each of the panelists. It's a pleasure to be here with Ambassador Wills, as well as with Eunice and Sarah, and thanks to the WTO for giving us this opportunity. Let me just start by saying, for those that don't know, the Information Technology Industry Council, we're a global tech association representing 80 members headquartered around the world and spanning virtually every vertical of the technology sector. And from the outset of the JSI, as Jake has already alluded to, we and our respective members have advocated for inclusion of services market access commitments as a really integral part of any negotiated outcome of the JSI. And as Jake, you've already started to do, I do think it's helpful to frame this discussion in terms of the importance of services, and digital services in particular, as inputs and enablers of all kinds of trade. Technological advances have not only greatly enabled trade in an increasing range of services sectors, but reliable services have become essential inputs to enable trade in goods. And certainly the pandemic did not start these trends, but it has underscored and accelerated some of them. And even today, I think we can look at the importance of the access to telecoms networks, to cloud processing, and to a range of digital communications tools as helping businesses, as well as helping us be here from 3 very different time zones today to speak to this group. And Jake, you already touched on this a bit, and we get into this in the paper, that despite the economy-wide importance of global services trade, there's a wide gap between applied regimes and international commitments on services market access. And meaningful market access restrictions persist in very important sectors. And even in those areas where certain barriers to digital trade have been lowered, the global regulatory environment for digital trade is diverse, is complex, and is evolving across countries. And I think that this is a reality that derives in large part from a lack of consistent market access commitments, as well as a lack of consistent application of good regulatory practices, which I hope that we can get into a bit later in the session. So I'd like to center today on services market access commitments as an essential complement to the kinds of commercially meaningful commitments that are already under discussion at the JSI. The evolving nature of digital services, and that both the digital and the physical infrastructures that enable them, means that the most forward-looking horizontal rules-based commitments, which are absolutely essential, need to be accompanied by robust market access commitments. And I think there are a couple of considerations here. A big component, Jake, as you mentioned, is that the establishment of binding market access commitments in the context of JSI negotiations would contribute to broader and more equitable distribution of benefits stemming from policies that promote open digital trade, including those rules-based provisions. The other bigger point, and I suspect my colleagues may touch on this on the panel, is that in many cases, services market access is necessary for firms to realize any benefit from rules-based commitments. With respect to prioritization of sectors, Jake, so the second part of your question, our aim in the paper, as you of course know, is to strike a balance between the broad-based benefits from expanding services market access across the gamut and a range of sectors, and to be a bit more realistic about the scope of the negotiations and prioritize those that we have seen, both through our independent analysis and through input from our respective member companies, as most crucial to enabling the digital trade and e-commerce ecosystems. And in that spirit, in developing our paper, we focused on 7 broad core areas: telecommunication services, computer and related services, electronic payment services, which I'm sure Sarah will speak to in greater detail, logistics and delivery services, marketing services, so-called creative services sectors, and finally, research and development services. I believe we'll have a chance to dig into these a bit more in the remainder of the discussion, so I'll leave it there for now, and very much looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks very much, Sam. So Sarah, I was going to turn to you first, and then Eunice. Given your perch at MasterCard, could you talk a little bit more specifically about the role that financial services market access plays in enabling digital trade in that e-commerce ecosystem?
Thanks, Jake, and thank you to the WTO for hosting us. And it's really nice to see everyone. I hope to see everyone in person very soon. And I really thank you both for putting that paper together, because as you know, this is something that I'm very passionate about. The importance of services market access to a digital trade agenda is essential. And I don't think there's really, I hope there's no doubt the role that financial services play in digital trade. If we look at how electronic payment services really connects buyers and sellers over the internet, there's no doubt. For consumers, it's access to goods and services in a trusted and secure environment. For businesses, it's access to markets and efficiency and security again. It's the network that we've built over the years through our partners. And I hope that this commerce evolution is really one that everyone can recognize. And, you know, COVID-19, everyone talks about this shift to digital, but in our own data set, we can see that this shift is actually permanent. We believe that between 20 and 30% of the digital shift is going to be permanent. And 30% of the shift is between cross-border e-commerce. So that's really important to recognize. And I think, you know, for the COVID-19 of sort of putting this to light, the biggest thing is that small and medium-sized enterprises, while they've increased gains, there's also a digital divide here that I think we at MasterCard have recognized that has been apparent through this shift. And it's the small businesses that need our help. So what we've been doing globally is committing to help medium and small enterprises get the digital tools and resources they need, because we've seen through our data that if the shift to digital continues, they're going to need those services. And we've got a new program that we just launched the other day called Strive. And what that is specifically targeting minority and women-owned businesses globally, giving them the digital tools and resources they need to get online and digitize. And we have other programs in the United States as well that really target this. But again, as I said, the barriers to big companies like us is increasing, but it's even more so for these small and medium-sized enterprises. And just to kind of go a little further is, if we think about all the stimulus and aid that the governments have provided, it's not enough, right? We need the private sector to stand up as well, but we can't do it alone. And I think if we just continue to have these barriers, it's not going to be essential for these businesses to continue online. And I'll go into more detail around the barriers, but maybe we can pause there. I just want to leave with a bit of optimism. So we do a lot of surveys for medium and small businesses, and we've done a recent one in Middle East and Africa, which we see the largest growth coming from. And we found that 78% of the small, medium-sized enterprises in Middle East and Africa are actually optimistic about going online and becoming digital. But they see 4 key barriers to their access. 1 is access to digital skills. 2 is the digital payment acceptance infrastructure that is lacking. 3 is access to finance. We all know that small and medium-sized enterprises need more access to smaller loans to help them increase their growth. And finally, 4th is better data and insights. They need these data and insights that companies like us provide to help them figure out where is their best market to attract. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and really good to hear about Strive. I think it's a great call out and something that we see a lot in our work with small businesses through our Global Innovation Forum, which is the need to help them do more to enable their digital transformations. And so this is a topic for another day, but it'd be interesting. We've been giving some thought about how you can improve sort of small business promotion programs and government assistance to help small businesses defray their costs of their digital transformations. And Singapore has been a leader in that space as well, Eunice. But so Eunice, let me maybe turn to you and just could you talk a little bit more, I think, from your role at Google and also as a former negotiator about the role that computer and related services play in enabling digital trade?
Sure. Thanks, Jake. And it's really good to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Always good to be back in WTO in some form, whether virtual or physical. So the question is really, what role do CRS, right, computer and related services, play in enabling digital trade? And maybe just to take 2 steps back, CRS really covers a whole host of digital services that one has come to associate with digital trade and e-commerce, right? So it would include things like data processing services, database services, software implementation services. So in more common speak, this would include things like cloud computing services, right? Whether you're thinking of, Google Cloud or Amazon Cloud, web services, such technologies have been really essential to enabling companies, whether big or small, helping them store information and optimize operations across borders in a very efficient manner. It would also include services like, video conferencing services that we're using right now, to connect across continents, and to enable basically people from different parts of the world to connect and to trade in this format. But more crucially, I think computer and related services really enable a very broad range of other services and trade, and this is something that I think Sam also mentioned just now. So, for example, having computer and related services serve as a catalyst, for to support telehealth services, to support e-learning services, to open up opportunities, also for business processing services, like that you see in the Philippines or in India. So really, by opening up market access in foundational services sectors like CRS, what you're essentially doing is to add a new engine of growth and productivity, right, to your economy by enabling local SMEs and traditional businesses to leverage on the internet and digital tools to reach a global audience. And we all know from COVID that digital tools have been such a lifeline. 1 in 3 U.S. small businesses reported that without digital tools, life would have been so much more difficult for them during the pandemic. So you see, I think it's quite obvious to everybody what the impact of it. I think especially when physical borders close, of digital tools and computer related services in facilitating trade and ensuring that kind of connectivity. And I think also in building a sort of resilience into your economy to withstand future shocks. So I'll leave it as that for now, and happy to comment on other issues later.
Great, thanks very much, Eunice. So Ambassador Wills, I know protocol would suggest that we start with you, but we had talked about it beforehand, and I think we wanted you to kind of come in and really give an update after hearing from the private sector about the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce. And so, how do you see services market access fitting into the JSI? And can you give maybe an update on the current state of market access discussions?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jake, and good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone watching. And thank you, Eunice, for sharing your Friday night with us. Jake, allow me to start by congratulating you on your new role as president of the NFTC. I wish you the best of success in this new role, but also to thank you and the NFTC, of course, and ITI for organizing this timely event. You've been champions of this topic, and today I feel privileged to be sharing this panel with the real experts. So on your questions, Jake, I'll take the first question first. How do I see the services market access fitting into the WTO JSI on e-commerce? The JSI on e-commerce is a two-track process. On one track, we have all the imaginable rules that countries need to have a robust electronic trade. And on the other side, we have the access that must be granted to crucial sectors to ensure that such rules land firmly in the territory of the participants. That's more or less how I see it. Leaving aside the architecture discussion of the outcome, I think that market access is a key for the correct harvest of all the rules we're negotiating. We have to remember that governments set the market conditions, but it is the private sector that function under such conditions and benefit from the rules achieved in the initiative. I see the discussions on market access as evidence of that. I don't know if you've had access to the consolidated negotiating text. In section F of that text, there are around 12 services sectors crucial for e-commerce. Some of those sectors refer to physical networks and telecommunications, others to logistics or business services related to computing. There are even sectors on distribution, payments, and technical analysis that, by the way, all of which are included in the ITI and FTC paper. So you can see already your influence in this topic. But the idea behind all of these sectors is to make sure that companies can actually rely on e-commerce to do their business. On a possible update on the current status of the services market access discussions, Jake, as I said before, negotiating market access in services is not a small challenge. And even if we can narrow down the scope under the JSI on e-commerce, it still remains a huge feat. So for now, 4 textual proposals have been tabled from the beginning of the negotiations. Those proposals contain specific sectoral requests that are reflected the proponents' priorities. But of course, they came from different members with different levels of development, so they vary a bit. The requests differed in scope, but had enough commonalities to give direction to the discussions. The 4 text requests were translated to, let's call it, schedule language in the facilitator's note on the list of proponent sectors of interest, which is the basis for the current section F in the consolidated negotiation text that was presented by the co-conveners. And let me pause here for 2 seconds to recognize the very hard work of the facilitator for market access. My colleague, Colombian delegate Manuel Chacon, who you all know, he's been doing a tremendous job facilitating the discussions on this topic, so a big thanks to him. So back to the update. In December last year, there was a dedicated plenary meeting on market access where participants exchanged their interests and concerns. The main issues raised by participants were the lack of clarity on the process, particularly on the time frame and modalities, as well as the complexity of having a market access negotiation in parallel to discussing the rules. So there's 2 tracks I was talking about at the beginning. So these are issues that remain open, and we need more work to overcome such complexities. This year, we revisited the market access negotiations during a July plenary session. It was a key meeting as members heard firsthand about the importance of having market access in services commitments in the JSI. And at that occasion, we were very, very lucky to have the ITI and the FTC explaining their paper to all participants. So thank you again for all of this. So I think the question that follows is, where do we go from here? And this is not even the $1 million question, but the $1 billion question. Some members are cautious of pushing too hard on the market access negotiations. I think, cognizant of the big momentum reached in the rules negotiations, and other members want these discussions regaining their rightful place among the priorities of the process. So we're there. We're trying to find the best way to address this issue and keep moving it forward. What I can say for sure, and I will never get tired of saying it, is that it's thanks to these kinds of events that will help us tip the balance towards more active discussions on this topic. So Jake, for now, I'll leave it there, but happy to come back in the rest of the panel.
Ambassador Wills, thank you very much for a very insightful and detailed update on where things stand. Really appreciate that, and also wanted to echo your thanks of Manuel, who's been terrific, and I know is working hard on these discussions. I think we've had a couple of questions come in from the audience, from the participants, and so one of the questions is around, okay, well, why is it important to do these services market access negotiations? And so, the question is, sort of e-commerce has been working just fine since the 1990s. It's even expanded during the pandemic. So, why do we need these new rules? Because it works just fine. And, I maybe just to add to that, what are the emerging services barriers? Are there emerging services barriers that we should be concerned with here? Maybe Eunice and then Sarah, go to you first, and then Sam.
Yeah, so I mean, from a private sector perspective, and I didn't realize this so much until I came over to the other side, right? Certainty is very important. And yes, you can argue that, things are working just fine. Why do we need these hard commitments? But from a business point of view, it's when you're going to pump money into entering a new market, you do want to be sure that, the rules are there to protect you. You want to be sure that, you are able to gain legitimate market access to certain services that you're providing in that foreign market. So, without this kind of certainty, I think it would be, a lot more risky for businesses when they decide, where to put their resources. It could make your market less attractive. Especially, I think, and this is unfortunate, but especially if you're a smaller market, if you have a big market, you say, okay, I have the heft, right? I have, like 500 million people, you have to come in anyway. But, if you're a small market, you're particularly disadvantaged if you don't have a clear set of rules and commitments on an international level that can give companies that kind of assurance that, that they will be able to operate smoothly in your market.
Thanks, Eunice. Sarah, do you want to add to that?
Sure. And if I look at it, purely from an electronic payment services perspective, GAP, there's only about 30% of members that have taken on commitments for EPS. And we see, that is a huge disadvantage. And, while, yes, the shift is growing and we're growing as well, but the barriers to entry, as Eunice pointed out, especially for smaller countries, is increasing. There's digital barriers like data localization, but for us, we're seeing unlevel playing fields in different countries through the form of, local standard restrictions on technology or unfair advantages for state-owned enterprises. And this really disadvantages, again, the small, medium-sized enterprises that could be taking advantage of some of these programs that I mentioned earlier, getting access to finance, getting access to markets. So, we are concerned about this trend of sort of rising barriers around the world. And as I said, GAP is outdated. And if we look at some of the modern trade agreements like CPTPP, USMCA, DEA, DIPA, those all, some of them at least, have market access commitments to kind of keep up with the trends.
Thanks, Sarah. Sam, do you want to jump in too?
Sure, thanks, Jake. I'll try and take a bit more of a macro view, since I think Eunice and Sarah have done a good job speaking to some of the more particular areas and have made some good points. And I would just, I think by way of prefacing my response, I mean, I think one angle you could take here is, yes, of course, there has been an explosion in e-commerce and digital trade since the close of the Uruguay round. But to a point that was made at the outset, I think a big part of services market access, again, is rendering the benefits from digital trade more equitable. And I hope we can come back to that point maybe in a bit more detail. But to your question, Jake, about trends and sort of what we're seeing. I think you had cited an OECD statistic at the outset that 2020 saw, in spite of everything going on with the pandemic, the introduction of twice as many services barriers to trade as 2019, many of those in areas like computer and related services. And so when we ask sort of what trends are we seeing in digital trade restrictiveness or services market access restrictiveness, the answer, unfortunately, is a lot of new ones, and for understandable reasons, as governments are actually seeking to regulate or legislate in new policy areas, and there are some new approaches that are being explored here. But even in areas that are pretty well founded, I think there is some cause for concern. Since 2017, a recent report found that the number of data localization measures in force around the world has more than doubled. You can see this at sort of the discrete measure level. Digital services taxes have gotten a lot of attention. For instance, that even when you have a very advanced multilateral process that's seeking to resolve this globally, you still have countries who are moving forward on an individual basis. And so it is a challenge. But I think maybe what I would focus on, and some of this echoes of what has already been said, is we're noting a trend in which the scope of some emerging digital regulation across jurisdictions is tailored in a way that deviates from good regulatory practices, which is to say from sound, transparent, objective criteria. And I think that this is really important. I mean, even where services markets are relatively open, foreign suppliers and SMEs in particular may be most severely hindered by their unfamiliarity with regulation, and they're being required to confront differing approaches across the markets in which they seek to supply services. And to Eunice's point, including small markets, some of what we looked at in the paper was research that found that in certain services sectors, transparency and other regulatory related measures can account for more than 50% of trade restrictiveness. So harmonizing the rules of the game or facilitating that convergence actually brings about the largest gains when countries have already brought down their trade barriers. So in that sense, we're really welcoming of efforts to expand acceptance of good regulatory practices as governments move forward with more targeted forms of digital regulation. And just to close, I want to pick up on a point that Sarah made with respect to international standards. And this I see as a bit of an extension of what we would consider good regulatory practices. In digital services, governments are increasingly applying standards-based or technical regulatory governance approaches to advance policies in areas of new technology, whether that's EPS or cybersecurity or AI or even tech-related industrial policy. And it's interesting. It's actually, it's not bad in and of itself, of course, that these approaches are being experimented with, but they often are transposing tools that have long been used to regulate goods. So things like standard setting practices, mandatory certification, conformity assessment, labeling, or other technical requirements. And they're transposing those to digital services. So I think there's a very legitimate conversation about the way in which those tools can be applied in the services realm. But it certainly underscores, I think, the importance of rules that have existed in the goods space around international standards and transparency in making sure that those are extrapolated and transposed to services. And so I'm happy to come back to that in more detail, but let me stop for now.
All right, so we could get down a rabbit hole really quickly on that, but and there's also, to your last point, the question of whether it makes sense to apply a regime that was intended for goods to services. And if you just look at, for example, electronic transmissions, right? I mean, if you were to think about going down the path of applying customs formalities and tariffs to electronic transmissions, that seems like an extremely burdensome, invasive, and inappropriate system to apply to services. Whereas, of course, you need that sort of system for goods. And so, maybe we can get into more of that discussion later. But Ambassador Wills, I mean, just to step back on that kind of broader question, why is services market access important in these JSI negotiations?
Thanks, Jake. And I think this time around, I'll stick with the term that was used by Eunice, and that's certainty. I think that certainty is key for reaping the actual benefits of this type of say, a trend of e-commerce. And for instance, for developing countries like Colombia, there are great opportunities in relation to the export of services associated to the fourth industrial revolution. And you may know this, our president, President Duque, is one of the biggest champions of the creative industries. And that's because we believe that a big proportion of our future economy may lie in creative industries. And of course, there are other topics like business-related services with high added value like BPO, ITO, and KPO, which are quickly becoming as well a big share of our exports. But in order to reap the benefits of this type of commitments, we need that certainty. And consolidating this type of commitments in a multilateral agreement precisely goes in that direction. So I think a key word that has come today in this panel was certainty, and I completely agree with what Eunice was saying. So I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thanks, Ambassador Wills. So I wanted to turn the conversation to some themes that we had touched on earlier around the role of services market access to support small businesses, inclusive trade, and development. And so, for me, just personally working with small businesses and through our Global Innovation Forum, I've seen the role of digital services in making trade more inclusive. So, the question that I would have is what role can services market access play in making trade more inclusive and ensuring benefits for small business and development? But just as kind of an add-on to that, we had another question come in, and Sarah, you had identified a number of barriers to e-commerce for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in developing countries, including things like access to finance. And so, are those issues being addressed by the e-commerce JSI? And how can the JSI ultimately contribute to development? Sarah, maybe I'll just sort of start with you.
Sure, thanks, Jake. I think that question is a really important one because it goes to the point about how do we help SMEs and how do we have more inclusive trade? And if we think about access to finance, a lot of small and medium enterprises, and in a lot of developing countries in particular, the banking infrastructure is not as developed as it is in other places. And by allowing more competition into the market, big players like MasterCard, but also we partner a lot with small fintechs and folks that can actually help us give those loans to the small businesses. And I can give you an example. In Africa, we've partnered with local fintech players to actually digitize small and medium-sized enterprises like supply chains. So when they're buying goods from a consumer goods company, we're taking that and digitizing it and giving that information to the bank that can then turn it into a small loan. Now that's helping those small, medium-sized enterprises actually grow their businesses and expand. It's been a successful program, so much so that we've expanded it all over the world. And I think, if I could just go back to a point that Ambassador Wills is making, and it's certainty, but it's also transparency. It's about attracting of that investment. Like Colombia is a great example. MasterCard has been growing our investment in Colombia because of the market access that we enjoy, but also the ability to come in and partner with local players. That's a really important piece of the puzzle.
Thanks, Sarah. Eunice, do you want to talk about the role of services market access for inclusive trade and development?
Yeah, I think when you open up services like, computer-related services, you really do open up new market opportunities for, a whole host of otherwise marginalized groups, right? So, to be able to connect to the world through digital services, women, minorities, people living in, some rural part of the world, can now connect, with to global markets, right? A Spanish language teacher in Bogota can teach me Spanish, right? You open up opportunities for stay-at-home mothers, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, who can sell, handmade products, to the world. And I think in the paper, it was pointed out that, I think WTO and World Bank concluded that policies promoting cross-border supply of services are important for women's economic opportunities. And that women-owned businesses that export are actually far more productive and far more profitable. So, it's really about enabling these groups that otherwise would be cut off from global trade to participate in global trade. And I think that therein lies that whole idea of making trade a lot more inclusive.
Thanks, Eunice. Ambassador Wills, you heard what Sarah said about the role of services market access in enabling partnerships with local economies, including in Colombia. Could you talk about that? The idea of how services market access can work to enable development and inclusive growth.
Yes, absolutely, Jake. And I completely agree. I mean, I think that for developing countries like Colombia, I mean, the effects of e-commerce are clearly positive. Small and medium-sized economies face many challenges when dealing with entrepreneurship, for instance, because of our limited domestic markets. So it becomes evident that for companies, particularly our MSMEs, global trade is key to grow and develop. And through e-commerce, this has been clear. I mean, we already know of benefits that e-commerce have brought relating to, for instance, diminishing the intermediation and logistics costs. But there is something that I would like to highlight as well, and that is the adoption of digital economies has helped MSMEs to find market niches abroad. And this goes to Eunice's example. So the Spanish teacher in Bogota might be able to teach somebody else Spanish anywhere else. I mean, I was about to use a similar example, but in my case, I think it would be a very frustrated teacher. So I was reluctant to use that example. But I mean, finding those market niches abroad is a key way to help develop this type of MSMEs. And this is only through the liberalization of e-commerce and the lifting of this type of restrictions. I think the beachfront of such revolution at some point was the online selling platforms, cooperative economy platforms, and even the crowdfunding solutions, which began in a way harvesting this overlooked local offer, and now it's a huge industry. So, but they come to our markets and help us understand those opportunities. And now local enterprises are also part of this revolution. And this goes to what Sarah was saying. So this type of partnerships are key. And definitely it's something that benefits developing countries like Colombia in its economic development.
Great. Thanks, Ambassador Wills. Sam, same question to you.
Sure, thanks, Jake. And I mean, I think to your baseline question, sort of what role can services market access play in making trade more inclusive and ensuring benefits for SMEs and small business and development? I think the baseline answer just reflects everything that my colleagues on the panel have said, and it's a really notable one. And so maybe I can take a step back and speak to some of what we saw in developing the paper. And to be honest, arguably the biggest common trend among the analyses that we looked at from sources that included independent studies, UNCTAD, the OECD, the World Bank, the WTO itself, are opportunities created by services market access, as well as regulatory compatibility and transparency to smaller firms and developing members. And we sort of broke this out in the paper, as you'll see, into a few different areas. And I won't speak to all of them, but maybe just to touch on three. The first is services market access openings do disproportionately benefit SMEs, as I think has been said a couple of times at this point. When services trade restrictions are eased, it's SMEs that are the first to gain. And again, I think this is somewhat intuitive, and it's a reflection of the fact that despite all of the digital tools that have created opportunities for firms across borders to operate right from their inception, these so-called born global firms that, Jake, I know the Global Innovation Forum does quite a bit of work with, high cost to entry stemming from divergent services regulation are disproportionately detrimental, and again, in some cases, prohibitive to firms with fewer resources and less exporting experience. One just sort of statistical piece of evidence we found for this was some OECD analysis that a country undertaking even moderate services market access openings increases by as much as 12% the chances that a firm with no established trading relationship there will start exporting to that country. And so I think that brings together the elements of certainty that Eunice and Ambassador Wills were speaking to, but also has a clear tie to smaller businesses, which are going to be less likely to sort of seek new markets in the first place, absent some clear certainty. The second basket of issues is coordinated services liberalization benefits developing economies and LDCs. And here, to go back to an earlier theme as well, increased services trade is a value multiplier. In addition to its direct effects, services provide inputs to all sectors, and in the case of telecoms and ICT services in particular, create productive value chains. So they boost value, they boost output, they boost exports in all industry sectors in which they're implemented. And just taking a look at some LDC statistics, while direct exports of services were just 13% of total exports in LDCs, services accounted for 39% of total value added in LDCs exports, which I think is really significant. And moreover, as UNCTAD has underscored, services are playing an increasingly important role for LDCs, not only as a source of export diversification, but also as a source of competitiveness for the economy as a whole by increasing productivity writ large. And I think just to close the last sort of bucket I'd like to speak to here is what's already been touched on, and Eunice had referenced this as well. Increased services trade opportunities make for a more inclusive trading system. And I think Eunice already spoke to a growing body of work that goes to show that services sectors in which women occupy a disproportionate share of the workforce, here I'm thinking education or health or social services, are experiencing a rapid expansion thanks to digitalization, as well as trends in areas like tourism. And so policies promoting traditional cross-border trade and services have been shown to be particularly important for enhancing women's economic opportunities. Maybe just one other example, and this wasn't in the paper, but many will be familiar with the World Trade Report from 2019, which focused on global services trade. And there are a lot of really great examples focusing on India in particular, and some evidence suggesting that opening up telecommunication services or business process outsourcing services has actually raised educational attainment. And there's one study that's cited in that WTO paper that suggests that opening up services has helped to close gender educational gaps by raising education levels among women. Similar for e-commerce, I think seen as particularly important for women because selling goods through digital channels can alleviate some of the constraints that women face when exporting, including time and mobility constraints. So we could go on with some of these examples, but I'll keep it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sam. So, I wanted to maybe look towards the ministerial and the future. I think look, maybe I'll step back for just a moment and say from NFTC's perspective, I think there absolutely needs to be concrete deliverables at the upcoming ministerial in Geneva. And, I think Ambassador Wills, it's really important for the institution and for the planet that includes fishery subsidies, but also includes things like the regular extension of the customs duty moratorium on electronic transmissions. But in this space that we're talking about right now, I think, we're really looking towards a down payment on an ambitious e-commerce agreement. And so, I think that's a much broader conversation than just services market access, because I think, some of the areas that are most farthest along are in digital trade commitments. And Ambassador Wills, you talked about that earlier on. But I think it's also important that the ministerial sets the table for ambitious work to come in 2022. And, we ought to start sort of getting rid of the idea that the health of the WTO rises and falls with the outcome from a ministerial that is, maybe held every 2 to 4 years. And so, from NFTC's perspective, what I hope can happen at the ministerial is for countries to get together and lay out a roadmap for ambitious services market access negotiations along the line of what's being discussed today. And so I wanted to ask that question of all of you, what do you hope for the future on services market access? And I would say, what is the future for services market access in the JSI negotiations and beyond? Are there other vehicles and forums that can also advance the market access principles that we're talking about here? We're talking, there's been some talk about a digital trade agreement or digital economy initiative in the Indo-Pacific. The United States and Europe are talking through this Trade and Technology Council. What are the right ways to advance services market access both inside and outside of the WTO? Ambassador Wills, I know you might be a little constrained about how you can talk about this given your role in the negotiations. I'll give you some time to think about it. Maybe you can go after everyone else. But Eunice, how about we go to you first?
I'm in two minds because I know, from my past life, the constraints in the WTO, but, now wearing this hat of mine, I completely agree that what industry seeks is a real commitment and roadmap. And I think probably the best outcome that we hope to see is a very strong political commitment from ministers that this would be an integral part of the JSI, negotiations going forward. I think it's quite clear that the JSI is not going to conclude at MC12, but that there needs to be some very clear commitment that this is not going to drop off, the negotiating agenda going forward. And I think beyond the JSI as well, we would also welcome at a more multilateral level, a revival of some type of discussion, at least in the CTSSS. There's a built-in mandate in GATS Article 19, right, for continued market access negotiations on services. So hoping that it's possible to revive some of that on a multilateral basis, that would also add and give some momentum to the JSI, market access talks. And then finally, would always welcome any additional market access commitments that the regional trade agreements can offer, whether this is in Indo-Pacific or sort of some of the existing upgrades of FTAs.
Great, thanks, Eunice. Sarah, how about you?
Thanks, Jake. And I think this is a really important and fundamental question to the WTO and the WTO of the future, which is something that our executive chairman likes to talk about. And I think, bilateral and regional deals can really only get us so far. We really need a strong multilateral organization like the WTO to make trade work for the world we live in today. And that is digital trade. And I think, I've been part of the JSI negotiations since the last ministerial and even before that. And I'm really pleased to see the progress made so far, but without the services market access component, I don't know if this is really going to be a meaningful agreement. And I do believe that it is within grasp. I think from a business community perspective, we'd rather, wait and get to this meaningful agreement than to just rush and have a agreement on rules. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, really like what you said about the limits of bilateral and regional and the importance of a strong WTO. I think that's certainly true for the e-commerce discussions. I think it's true more broadly for the trading system as well. Sam, did you want to jump in on this idea of the future of market access in the WTO and beyond?
Sure. I think I would just quickly echo quite a lot of what's just been said, including Sarah's point that I think more broadly, representing a broader set of companies as well. Our interest has also been and has always been in a commercially meaningful agreement, both in respect of rules-based provisions as well as the inclusion of services market access. And so we are, I think, clear-eyed and realistic with respect to what can be achieved at MC12. I agree with you, Jake. MC12 is not the end-all be-all of what needs to be demonstrated to business and the public. I think it is one milestone, but it should represent the continuation of a lot of the good work that all of the delegations in Geneva have been contributing to. And just a quick plug, I think, for domestic services regulation that you mentioned at the outset, that's heartening. And I've talked a lot about good regulatory practices. I'll probably keep talking about good regulatory practices, but there are some facets of that in the domestic services regulation, and I think that's great. Same to your point on digital trade agreements. Of course, there are limitations to what can be done regionally and bilaterally, but those, I think, insofar as the multilateral system is concerned, are good sort of proving grounds for what countries can achieve and how services market access may be woven into broader digital economy agreements like the DIPA or like digital economy agreements between Singapore and Australia, or ones now being negotiated with Korea and beyond. And so I think those have their place in demonstrating sort of a high standard that can hopefully be transferred and built on in the WTO. And then just a last point, not strictly services market access and sort of the GATS or the Council for Trade and Services special session, but Jake, you mentioned the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. I think an absolute baseline and clear objective and priority for MC12 is its renewal, recognizing that rendering permanent is a discussion under the JSI and is perhaps a more ambitious target, but I would say from ITI's perspective, the moratorium has been one of the shining successes of the WTO since 1998 in preventing the emergence of an entirely new class of trade barrier. I think it's fundamental to this work. And so its renewal would certainly be a strong signal of the relevance of the WTO and would hold a lot of importance, I think, for all those concerned. Any consumer, any worker, any business using digital services, I think has a stake in making sure that that system moves on as it is.
Great, thanks very much, Sam. And you actually answered a question that I was going to ask from the audience, or at least partially, about whether the domestic services regulation text, sort of achieves some of the aims that you mentioned earlier on when you were talking about good regulatory practices. And so thank you for doing that. Would also say that completely agree about the place of regional and bilateral agreements as a complement to the multilateral process. And if you look at what's going on with the DPEN and these other negotiations and agreements that you mentioned, I mean, in addition to the concrete commitments, which are ought to be table stakes, it's interesting to see the ways in which they are using the agreements as sandboxes for discussing emerging regulations and frontier technologies. And so certainly something that I think the United States and a number of other countries should look into. Ambassador Wills, do you want to jump in on the future of negotiations on services market act?
Yes, Jake, and thank you for giving me some time. I mean, I know it's late in time to be saying this, but we're currently working on what the particular outcomes in MC12 should look like. And this includes, of course, the JSI on e-commerce. So at this moment, I can't say exactly what we'll see as an outcome by MC12, but I would say that based on the positive engagement of the participants, I remain optimistic that we can get good momentum going for work after MC12. So I remain optimistic of how the negotiations are going and how we can keep developing this process after MC12. And I must say that I appreciate all of you sharing your views in this forum, because I do believe that this is why the WTO holds the public forum. And we're here to listen to the private sector, to you, to understand, and hopefully to act accordingly. So expectations, at least on my part, have been well noted. And now we'll need to keep working to meet those expectations here in the WTO. And on your second part of the question on other alternatives, other forums where we can try to negotiate this. I mean, I think I share what has been said before. I can't really imagine another forum to negotiate services market access with comparable impact to that in the WTO. There are other regional trade agreements which also have broad participation and deep market commitments. But arguably, most of those participants to the regional trade agreements already have liberalized their economies through previous initiatives. So the immediate impact is limited. I do think that only the WTO will be able to reach far and wide among other countries that still are on the verge of liberalization. So hard to say if there's a replacement. Maybe other alternatives, but with limited impact, not as much as in the WTO.
Great, thanks, Ambassador Wills. So we haven't talked very much about telecoms. I know there was a brief mention of it earlier, but there was a question from the audience about whether including the telecoms reference paper or some sort of updated version of it in the JSI e-commerce would help to kind of alleviate some of the problematic policies that we talked about earlier on. If so, can you talk about what some of those, how it would do so, and which countries are kind of most inclined to do those, to put in those kind of barriers. Eunice, I mean, as a former negotiator, wonder if you had any perspective on this.
I mean, the answer is yes, that there would be a lot of value in sort of updating the reference paper. It's a difficult thing to do because I don't think all of the JSI members have signed on to the reference paper in the first place. But I do see a lot of value if it can be if it can sort of cover some of the, at the end of the day, it's about GRPs, right? It's about sort of ensuring that markets still remain open to competition, in a way that, sort of is fair to all players. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of prioritization, I would say, do the market access. Telecoms paper is a great to have, but yeah, it's a, but maybe, one practical intermediate step could be to get more members to sign on to the existing reference paper, if a new reference paper cannot be achieved.
Great. Does anyone else want to jump in on that question? Thank you, Eunice. No. All right. Well, look, we're getting to time, and so maybe just very briefly to the last question to each of you. So beyond everything that we've discussed already, are there other best practices that governments can implement to promote open markets for e-commerce related services and service providers? Sam, do you want to start on this one?
Sure, yeah, and this is, again, I'm going to continue to hammer home this notion of good regulatory practices, and I appreciate the question from the audience about domestic services regulation, because there certainly are some components of that negotiated outcome that get into this realm of GRPs, but I think there's more that we would like to see, and I'd like to tie this back to the trend that I mentioned, where governments, again, are increasingly applying standards-based or technical regulatory governance approaches to advance policies relating to a range of new technologies. And I gave some examples of this, but just to be a little bit more concrete about what this is sort of looking like in practice, this could be certification requirements for cybersecurity or privacy. We're seeing this now across markets. It could be third-party testing requirements for something like artificial intelligence, high-risk applications of AI. Standards-based or code of conduct-based data portability requirements, or more broadly, frameworks to regulate or establish procurement regimes for other emerging technologies. And so I imagine some in the audience will, be familiar with some of these measures that are popping up in different jurisdictions. And I think the point to make here is that the TBT agreement, as well as subsequent trade agreements, contain provisions that require WTO members to base technical regulations on international standards. However, these TBT provisions apply to goods almost exclusively, and therefore don't capture divergent technical requirements on standards that could impede trade in digital services. So I think this is really relevant. I think more and more, even though work on technical standards and international standards has been underway for decades and decades, there's a lot of talk about technical standards in the technology space these days, and really across. Yes.
Sam, I'm sorry. I think they're actually going to cut us off in 5 minutes, and so I just wanted to make sure that everyone had a chance to get in with one more minute remaining, with another minute. So, Ambassador Wills, can I turn to you? I'm sorry, Sam.
No, that's all right.
Ambassador Wills, can I turn to you for kind of closing thoughts on those, additional best practices?
Yeah, absolutely, Jake. And well, I've always thought that unilateral liberalization, when supported by adequate legislation and international commitments, including, for instance, market access obligations, is always a good sign of a country's commitment of promoting an open market economy. It would be hard for me to talk about the best practices. I wish I knew some of the best practices out there, because we would be implementing them back home. So I think it's of more value for the panel and for me to listen to the others and see what the best practice I can take note of and transmit to Capital.
Well, look, before I let you go, just I wanted to say thank you again for your leadership on this and on fisheries. It's important, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. Sarah, how about you?
Sure, I'll be very quick and pick up what Sam was just talking about on standards. For us, international standards means open markets, means global interoperability. That means that everyone operates from the same level playing field, and we can access markets across the board. So interoperability and international standards are really important.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And Eunice, you get the last word.
Yeah, I mean, agree with everything that Sam and Sarah said about standards and GRPs. But one thing I think that's often neglected is this whole idea of, when doing that digital regulation within your domestic market, it's really important to have an interagency process. It's something that, because it's something that's cross-cutting across the economy. And I think a lot of countries neglect that, right? It's only done by the communications ministry or the information ministry. But you can see that there are often cross-border impacts and trade impacts, of domestic regulation that may not be, that may come into tension with international trade. So, in terms of promoting open markets, I think something for governments to take note of.
Great, thanks, Eunice, and thank you all on the panel and in the audience for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk about services market access and the JSI negotiations. We look forward to continuing the conversation and to outcomes of the ministerial and beyond. Have a great weekend. Bye, everyone.